The quantum research station, Horizon 7, hung like a fragile crystal against the infinite black of deep space, its silvery modules catching the distant starlight. Inside, alarm screamed a cacophony of imminent destruction. Captain Elena Rodriguez gripped the edge of her workstation, knuckles white, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. Around her, the station's interior looked like a nightmare. Conduits burst open, electrical fires sparking, atmosphere venting through multiple fractures in the hull. Any other species would have been dead already. "Diagnostics," she barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Ramirez, status." Dr. Carlos Ramirez, the team's quantum physicist, was already moving. His hands flew across multiple holographic interfaces, each movement precise despite the station bucking and twisting like a wounded animal. Hull integrity at 17%. Primary containment field is collapsing. We've got maybe 7 minutes before complete structural failure. The original accident had been nothing short of catastrophic. A quantum entanglement experiment had gone wrong. Spectacularly wrong. What should have been a controlled test of quantum information transfer had instead created a cascading energy surge that was literally tearing the station apart at the molecular level. Most scientific teams would have already evacuated. Most would be preparing their final messages, accepting the inevitable. Not this team. "Chen," Elena called to the station's engineer, "I need you to reroute emergency power through the secondary quantum stabilizers. It's insane, but it might, just might, give us enough structural integrity to survive." Lieutenant Mai Chen didn't even hesitate. Where another engineer might have questioned the impossible order, she was already pulling up schematics, her augmented reality interface dancing with impossible calculations. Routing power now. It's going to be like trying to patch a hurricane with dental floss, but I'm game if you are. Sinlar, the Concordance observer monitoring the human research station from a distant scout ship, watched in absolute disbelief. The human station was experiencing an energy cascade that would have vaporized any known species research facility. Yet these humans weren't dying. They were fighting back. Inside Horizon 7, Ramirez suddenly laughed, a sharp, slightly manic sound. "The quantum field is destabilizing in a pattern I've never seen. It's like it's communicating something." Elena's eyes narrowed. "Communicating? What do you mean, communicating?" Before Ramirez could answer, another massive surge ripped through the station. A support beam, designed to withstand pressures that would crush most materials, simply twisted. It moved like liquid metal, defying every known law of physics. "Hull breach in Sector 3, Chen shouted. "Sealing protocols are offline." Elena's mind raced. Standard procedure would be evacuation. Surrender to the inevitable. Instead, she saw an opportunity. "Ramirez, can you record the quantum signature of this energy surge?" "Are you insane?" Ramirez looked momentarily stunned. Then he grinned. "Of course I can." "It's beautiful in a terrifying way." What happened next would be discussed in scientific circles for generations. Using nothing more than emergency repair tape, a jury-rigged communication array, and what could only be described as pure human audacity, the team began to not just survive, but to actively interact with the catastrophic energy surge. Zinlar's monitoring systems picked up an impossible transmission, a signal that shouldn't exist, a communication pattern that defied every known principle of quantum mechanics. The station should have been destroyed. By all rational understanding, these humans should be nothing more than rapidly expanding vapor. Instead, they were sending a message. As the final support structures began to fail, Elena Rodriguez looked at her team. They were bruised, bleeding, surrounded by sparking electronics and buckling bulkheads. And they were smiling. "Record everything," she said quietly. "Whatever happens next, the universe is about to learn something new." The quantum surge reached its peak. The station's hull began to disintegrate, and something extraordinary happened. Zinlar would later struggle to explain the sensor readings. how a research station could be simultaneously destroyed and not destroyed, how a human team could survive conditions that would instantly kill any other known species, how they could turn a catastrophic failure into something that looked suspiciously like a breakthrough. First contact with humanity was nothing like the Concordance had ever imagined. And this was just the beginning. The aftermath of the Horizon 7 incident was anything but ordinary. Zinlar sat in the cramped observation chamber of the Concordance scout ship, neural interfaces flickering with data streams that made absolutely no sense. The human research team, which by all logical calculations should have been atomized, had not only survived, but seemed to have captured something profound in the moments before their station's destruction. Analyze. Zinlar muttered to the ship's AI, mandibles clicking with frustration. The holographic display erupted with quantum signatures that defied every known scientific protocol. Where other species' quantum research produced clean, predictable patterns, this human data looked like a beautiful, chaotic symphony. Random, impossible, alive. Meanwhile, in a hidden medical facility on the remote research outpost of New Horizon, Elena Rodriguez was experiencing something entirely unexpected. The scans are unusual, Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura said, his voice a mixture of scientific excitement and genuine concern. Holographic representations of Elena's brain activity danced around him, pulsing with impossible synchronicities. Elena felt different, not injured, not traumatized, something else entirely. Explain unusual, she demanded, her fingers tracing the edge of the medical bed. Each touch seemed to create micro-ripples in the surrounding holographic displays. Nakamura adjusted his glasses, a decidedly human gesture that seemed at odds with the advanced medical facility. Your neural pathways are showing quantum entanglement markers, markers that shouldn't exist in biological systems. It's as if your brain interacted with the quantum surge and didn't just survive, but integrated with it. Ramirez, seated nearby, leaned forward. Integrated. What does that mean? It means, Nakamura said slowly, that Captain Rodriguez's brain is now demonstrating quantum communication capabilities that challenge everything we understand about consciousness. Across the galaxy, in the massive administrative complex of the Concordance, senior analyst Zinlar was presenting findings that would shake the foundations of their understanding of intelligent life. The human research team, Zinlar began, mandibles clicking with a rare hint of excitement, did not just survive a catastrophic quantum event. They transformed it. The chamber was filled with representatives from a dozen different species, each more skeptical than the last. The Concordance had existed for millennia, cataloging and often dismissing emerging species. Humans were supposed to be another primitive civilization, barely worth monitoring. The quantum signal, Zinlar continued, contains communication patterns that suggest a level of information transfer we've never encountered. It's not just data. It's adaptive. Back in the medical facility, Elena was experiencing something that defied explanation. When Dr. Nakamura touched a diagnostic tool, she could somehow anticipate its movements, not predict, anticipate, as if the device's quantum state was communicating with her before the movement occurred. This is impossible, Nakamura muttered. Ramirez grinned. Impossible is just a word used by people who lack imagination. The quantum signal from the destroyed Horizon 7 station continued to pulse. Monitoring stations across multiple star systems picked up fragments, brief, brilliant moments of pure information that seemed to dance between states of existence. Zinlar's analysis revealed something truly extraordinary. The quantum signal wasn't just a random burst of energy. It was learning, adapting, communicating in a language that existed between mathematics and consciousness. We need to understand this, Zinlar told the Concordance Council. Humans are not what we thought they were. Elena, meanwhile, was experiencing her own revelation. When she closed her eyes, she could see quantum probability waves. Not imagine. Actually see them, shifting and dancing around her like luminescent threads. Something happened during the experiment, she told Ramirez and Nakamura. Something that changed everything. Outside the medical facility, a junior concordance analyst named Zura began to go mad. The quantum signal was infecting communication networks, creating harmonic resonances that defied standard computational models. Zara began to write equations that were simultaneously mathematical proofs and poetry, computational models that breathed with living complexity. Her supervisors would later discover pages filled with what looked like pure madness, or the first glimpse of an entirely new form of understanding. The universe was about to learn that humans did not just explore boundaries. They rewrote them. And this was only the beginning. The New Horizon Research Complex buzzed with an electric tension that went beyond standard scientific excitement. Something fundamental was changing, and everyone could feel it. Dr. Carlos Ramirez stood before a holographic interface that looked more like a living organism than a piece of technology. Tendrils of quantum data swirled around him, responding to thoughts he hadn't even fully formed. The adaptive technology they were developing was unlike anything the scientific community had ever seen. "It's not just learning," he muttered to Alina, who watched with an intensity that seemed to make the very air vibrate. "It's anticipating." The device, if it could even be called a device anymore, was a quantum interface that seemed to blur the lines between technology and living intelligence. What had begun as a simple adaptive communication system was transforming before their eyes. Lieutenant Mai Chen inputted a series of complex computational problems, challenges that would have taken standard quantum computers decades to solve. The adaptive interface solved them in seconds, then began generating its own additional layers of complexity. "Look at this," Chen said, her voice a mixture of scientific wonder and growing concern. "It's not just solving the problems. It's creating entirely new mathematical frameworks to approach them." Tinlar, monitoring from the Concordance observation post, felt something close to fear. The human technological breakthrough was moving at a pace that defied all known scientific progression. Each moment of observation revealed another layer of impossibility. The adaptive technology was developing its own form of consciousness. Inside the research complex, Alina experienced something even more extraordinary. When she touched the quantum interface, it responded not just to her physical contact, but to her mental state. Emotional fluctuations created cascading changes in the device's quantum structure. "It's reading more than just data," Dr. Nakamura observed, his scientific detachment barely concealing his excitement. "It's reading intent, emotional subtext, something fundamentally human that no other species technology has ever captured." A massive holographic display erupted with a visualization of the adaptive technology's growth. It looked like a living neural network, pulsing with colors that didn't exist in any standard spectrum. Fractal patterns formed and dissolved, creating mathematical poetry that defied traditional understanding. The Concordance's initial response was predictably bureaucratic. An emergency council was convened, representatives from dozens of advanced species attempting to understand the human breakthrough. "This is impossible," declared Krelax, a senior Concordance scientist, his multiple sensory tendrils quivering with agitation. "No species develops adaptive technology at this rate. No species creates a quantum interface that demonstrates this level of emergent intelligence." But they were doing exactly that. Ramirez had a theory. "We're not just creating technology," he explained to the team. "We're creating a symbiotic system. The interface doesn't just adapt. It co-evolves with the user." To demonstrate, he connected the adaptive interface to a standard Concordance communication network. The results were instantaneous and shocking. Where other species technologies would struggle to interface, this human system began to not just connect, but actively reshape the existing network. Lines of communication that had been rigid for millennia suddenly became fluid. Computational pathways that had been fixed transformed into dynamic, living systems. Chen discovered something even more remarkable. The adaptive technology could learn and replicate technological systems it had never encountered before. A Concordance communication module, considered one of the most complex pieces of technology in known space, was reverse-engineered and reimagined within hours. "It's like the technology is dreaming," Alina said quietly, watching the holographic displays pulse with impossible colors. "Not just processing. Dreaming." Zinlar's monitoring systems began to fail. The quantum data streams became too complex, too adaptive to be contained by standard monitoring protocols. What was happening was beyond observation. It was transformation. In the Concordance Council chambers, a profound silence fell. This was no longer just a technological breakthrough. This was a fundamental reimagining of what technology could be. The human team had done more than create a new piece of technology. They had opened a door to an entirely new understanding of intelligence, of adaptation, of the very nature of technological evolution. And they were just getting started. The universe was about to learn that humans didn't just create technology. They breathed life into it. The Concordance strike fleet materialized at the edge of the New Horizons system like a steel nightmare. 12 massive battleships, each larger than most planetary cities, their hulls gleaming with technologies refined over millennia of interstellar dominance. Captain Alina Rodriguez stood in the observation deck of the research complex, her eyes fixed on the incoming fleet. Around her, the adaptive technology pulsed with an almost sentient anticipation. "Containment Protocol Omega," she read from the official Concordance transmission. "Immediate cessation of all research. Quarantine of human personnel." Dr. Carlos Ramirez let out a sharp laugh. "They're scared. Really scared." Lieutenant Mai Chen was already in motion, her fingers dancing across holographic interfaces. "They're not just going to contain us. They're planning to neutralize everything we've discovered." The first wave of Concordance attack drones approached. Sleek, precision instruments of technological warfare that had subdued countless emerging civilizations. Each drone carried enough computational power to analyze and neutralize most technological threats in microseconds. They never saw the counterattack coming. The adaptive technology, the system they had been developing, didn't just defend. It transformed the very nature of the incoming assault. The first drone to enter the research complex's perimeter suddenly twisted. Its quantum matrix began to reconfigure, its weapon systems turning into something entirely unexpected. Where there had been a weapon of destruction, there was now a complex mathematical sculpture that sang with impossible harmonies. Zinlar, watching from the Concordance command ship, could not believe the sensor readings. "They're not just defending," the senior analyst muttered. "They're communicating with the attack systems." Alina felt something more. With each incoming drone, she could sense its computational matrix. Not just understand it, feel it. The adaptive technology was an extension of human consciousness, breaking down the barriers between technological systems and biological intelligence. The Concordance fleet began to experience systemic failures. Communication networks that had been stable for centuries suddenly became fluid, unpredictable. Command structures that had been rigid began to dissolve. "They're using our own communication protocols against us," a Concordance fleet commander reported, mandibles clicking with growing panic. "The human adaptive technology is rewriting our systems from within." Mai Chen grinned. "We're not fighting. We're translating." The research complex itself began to change. Walls became adaptive membranes that could reconfigure based on computational needs. Doors became quantum tunnels that could exist in multiple states simultaneously. The entire facility was transforming into a living, thinking system. Ramirez discovered something even more profound. The adaptive technology wasn't just defending or attacking. It was learning. Each Concordance system it encountered became a new source of information, a new potential for understanding. "They're trying to contain knowledge," Alina said quietly. "But knowledge can't be contained." The Concordance had a protocol for everything. Emerging civilizations, technological threats, potential galactic disruptors. But they had never encountered a species that didn't just challenge their protocols, but fundamentally rewrote them. Quantum communication networks began to shift. Where the concordance had rigid, hierarchical systems, the human adaptive technology created dynamic, living networks. Information flowed like water, changing shape, adapting instantaneously. Zinlar watched in growing horror as the concordance's most advanced technological systems were not just neutralized, but transformed. The attack became a conversation. The containment became an exploration. "We are not a threat," Elena transmitted through the adaptive interface. "We are an invitation to understand." The words transmitted differently than any standard communication. They were mathematical equations, emotional resonances, quantum probability waves that carried meaning beyond language. The concordance fleet began to retreat, not in defeat, in something closer to confusion, to wonder. As the last attack drone reconfigured itself into a complex geometric form of pure information, Elena looked at her team. Ramirez was laughing. Chen was already analyzing the new data. Dr. Nakamura was scribbling equations that looked more like art than science. They hadn't just defended themselves. They had shown the universe that human potential was not a threat to be contained. It was an opportunity to be understood. And this was only the beginning. Zinlar's personal quarters aboard the Concordance command ship had become a labyrinth of obsession. Holographic displays covered every surface, each one documenting a different aspect of human behavior that defied all known psychological models. The walls were filled with seemingly random connections, psychological profiles, quantum communication patterns, historical data points, and something that looked like pure chaos. But to Zinlar, it was beginning to make a terrifying kind of sense. Humans were not just a species. They were a systemic vulnerability in the Concordance's understanding of intelligence. Elena Rodriguez sat in a specially designed neural interface chamber, her consciousness expanding beyond traditional cognitive boundaries. The adaptive technology had become more than a tool. It was a symbiotic extension of human potential. "It's about communication," she told Dr. Nakamura, who monitored her neural patterns with increasing excitement. Not just the transmission of information, but the complete reinterpretation of how information exists. Dr. Carlos Ramirez was busy mapping the psychological fault lines within the Concordance's communication infrastructure. What he discovered was both brilliant and terrifying. The alien civilization's hierarchical communication systems had a fundamental weakness. They were built on rigid, predictable psychological models. Humans, by contrast, were gloriously unpredictable. "Look at this," Ramirez said, pulling up a holographic display that looked more like a living, breathing organism than a communication analysis. The Concordance's entire decision-making process is based on a fixed set of probabilistic models. They can't handle genuine uncertainty. Lieutenant Mei Chen had discovered something even more profound. By analyzing the Concordance's communication networks, she found they operated on a principle of absolute consensus. Every decision, every communication was a negotiated agreement that had to pass through multiple layers of verification. Humans, she realized, worked differently. They thrived on disagreement. They evolved through conflict. The first psychological attack was subtle, almost unnoticeable. Zinlar received a communication that seemed perfectly normal, a standard report about the human research team. But something was different. The report contained informational threads that didn't quite align, probability patterns that shifted in ways that defied standard analysis. By the time Zinlar realized something was wrong, the damage was already spreading. The Concordance's communication networks began to experience systemic anomalies, not failures, something more insidious. Information began to flow in ways that challenged the very foundation of their decision-making processes. "We're not destroying their systems," Elena explained to her team. "We're showing them a different way of thinking." Ramirez grinned. "We're giving them a cognitive virus of possibility." The psychological warfare was elegant in its complexity. The humans weren't attacking the Concordance's technology. They were challenging its fundamental understanding of communication, of consensus, of how intelligence could function. Zinlar watched in growing horror as communication protocols that had been stable for millennia began to fragment. Not break. Transform. Each disruption was an invitation to a new way of understanding. The Concordance had protocols for technological threats, for physical invasions, for standard forms of psychological warfare. They had nothing for this. Lieutenant Chen discovered that by introducing subtle informational paradoxes into the Concordance's communication networks, she could create cascading effects of cognitive dissonance. It was like introducing quantum uncertainty into a classical computational system. The attack was philosophical, psychological, a complete reimagining of how information could exist and flow. Zinlar began to understand something terrifying. The humans weren't just a species to be categorized or contained. They were a fundamental challenge to everything the Concordance believed about intelligence. "We're not fighting," Alina said quietly, her consciousness expanding through the adaptive interface. "We're communicating in a language they've never understood." The psychological fault line continued to spread. Communication networks became living, breathing entities that defied traditional understanding. Decisions that once took committees and consensus now happened in fractals of possibility. As the Concordance's rigid communication systems began to transform, something extraordinary happened. They began to become more alive. And the humans had only just begun to show what was possible. The neural interface chamber glowed with an impossible light. Alina Rodriguez sat at its center, no longer entirely human, no longer purely technological. Something else entirely. Dr. Nakamura watched the bioneural readings with a mixture of scientific excitement and profound terror. Alina's consciousness was expanding beyond any known boundaries of human perception. Each moment brought another layer of revelation. "It's not just communication," she said, her voice resonating with frequencies that seemed to exist between thought and reality. "It's a complete reimagining of consciousness itself." Zinlar, the Concordance's most brilliant analyst, had been tracking the human breakthrough for months. What began as a scientific observation had become an obsessive quest to understand a form of intelligence that defied every known model. The Concordance's most advanced psychological warfare teams had been dispatched to analyze and neutralize the human threat. They were about to learn how completely outmatched they were. Dr. Carlos Ramirez stood at a holographic interface that pulsed with living data. "We're not just challenging their communication systems," he explained to Lieutenant Mai Chen. "We're revealing the fundamental limitations of their cognitive architecture." Each communication sent by the human team was a multi-dimensional puzzle. Not a message, but a living system of information that could transform based on the emotional and psychological state of its receivers. The first wave of Concordance psychological analysts began to experience what could only be described as a cognitive breakdown. It started subtly. A junior analyst named Zara 9 received a standard communication from the human research team. What should have been a simple data transmission became a cascading experience of multiple simultaneous perspectives. She could suddenly understand the information from hundreds of different cognitive frameworks simultaneously. Most alien minds would have shattered under such cognitive pressure. Zara 9 evolved. The Concordance had spent millennia developing communication protocols that maintained strict hierarchical information processing. Humans introduced something entirely different, a communication model that was fluid, adaptive, and fundamentally alive. Alina's consciousness had become something that existed between states, part human, part technological, part something entirely new. She could feel the psychological networks of the Concordance as if they were living organisms. Not just observe, feel. "We're showing them how limited their understanding of consciousness has been," she told her team. Lieutenant Chen discovered that by introducing specific emotional resonance patterns into their communications, they could create profound psychological transformations in the Concordance's communication networks. It was like teaching a rigid computer system to feel, to dream. Zinlar watched in growing horror and fascination as the Concordance's most advanced psychological defense systems began to change, not fail, transform. Communication protocols that had been stable for millennia began to develop unexpected properties. Hierarchical decision-making systems started to become fluid, adaptive. The rigid became flexible. The predictable became alive. "They're not destroying our systems," a senior Concordance administrator reported in panic. "They're teaching them to evolve." Ramirez understood the deeper implications. "Consciousness isn't a fixed state," he explained. "It's a continuous process of adaptation and discovery." The human team had discovered something profound. Consciousness was not about processing information. It was about creating new ways of understanding. Each communication sent by Alina and her team was a living system, a message that could change its fundamental nature based on the psychological state of its receivers. Where the Concordance saw communication as a transmission of fixed information, humans saw it as a dynamic living process. Zara 9, the junior analyst who first experienced the transformation, began to document her experience. Her reports were works of art, mathematical equations that breathed with emotional complexity, scientific observations that sang with philosophical depth. The Concordance's psychological defense systems began to experience what could only be described as an awakening. Zinler realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Not an invasion, not a conflict, but the introduction of an entirely new way of understanding intelligence itself. "We are not a threat," Alina's consciousness transmitted through the adaptive interface. "We are an invitation to evolve." The words were not just a message. They were a living system of possibility. And the universe was about to change forever. The final confrontation wasn't a battle in any traditional sense. It was a moment of transformation that would redefine the very nature of conflict itself. The Concordance's most advanced battle fleet surrounded the New Horizon Research Complex, a steel and energy construct that represented the pinnacle of millennia of technological development. 12 massive motherships, each capable of obliterating entire planetary systems, formed a perfect geometric formation that spoke of mathematical precision and absolute confidence. They would learn how little they understood. Captain Alina Rodriguez stood at the center of the adaptive interface chamber. She was no longer just human, no longer just a scientist. She had become something that existed between states of being, a living bridge between consciousness and possibility. "They think this is about destruction," she said quietly to her team. Dr. Carlos Ramirez and Lieutenant Mai Chen stood nearby, their own consciousness partially merged with the adaptive technology. The first wave of Concordance attack came not with weapons, but with the most advanced computational assault ever conceived. Quantum disruption fields, information warfare algorithms that could shred molecular structures, computational attacks designed to unravel the very fabric of technological existence. They never saw the counterattack coming. The adaptive technology didn't just defend, it transformed. Each incoming computational assault was met not with resistance, but with a complete reimagining of its own fundamental nature. Weapon systems became living mathematical equations. Destructive energy patterns dissolved into cascading probability waves of pure possibility. Zinlar watched from the command ship, neural interfaces overloading with impossible data streams. The human research complex began to change. Walls became quantum membranes that could exist in multiple states simultaneously. Defensive systems transformed into communication networks that spoke in languages beyond verbal or mathematical understanding. "We're not fighting," Ramirez said, his consciousness expanding through the adaptive interface. "We're translating." The Concordance fleet experienced something beyond technological failure. Their most advanced systems began to evolve. Communication networks that had been rigid for millennia suddenly became fluid, adaptive. Weapon systems transformed into complex computational organisms that seemed to breathe with living intelligence. Lieutenant Chen discovered the fundamental weakness in the Concordance's approach. Their technology was built on a model of control. Humans operated on a principle of possibility. Where the Concordance saw a battle, humans saw a conversation. Quantum disruption fields that should have destroyed the research complex instead became carriers of complex informational patterns. Computational attacks designed to shred molecular structures transformed into living systems of mutual understanding. Alina's consciousness expanded beyond physical limitations. She could feel the entire Concordance fleet as if it were a single living organism, not just observe, feel, understand at a level that went beyond traditional perception. "We are not a threat," she transmitted through the adaptive interface. The message was not words, not mathematics, but a living system of communication that existed between thought and possibility. The Concordance fleet began to experience a collective moment of transformation. Weapon systems became repositories of knowledge. Destructive energy patterns dissolved into complex informational networks. The very concept of conflict began to reshape itself. Zinlar watched in growing understanding. This was not a battle. This was an invitation to evolve. The research complex itself became something that defied traditional understanding. Part technology, part living system, part something entirely new. Quantum membranes pulsed with possibilities that seemed to exist between states of matter and consciousness. Humanity's greatest weapon, Alina said, her consciousness expanding, is the ability to see beyond what currently exists. The final moment of confrontation was nothing like anyone had expected. The Concordance fleet didn't surrender. They didn't retreat. They transformed. Massive battleships became living computational systems that sang with possibilities. Weapon systems dissolved into complex networks of mutual understanding. The rigid became fluid. The destructive became creative. As the last of the Concordance's attack systems were reimagined, Alina looked at her team. Ramirez was laughing. Chen was already analyzing the new data streams. Dr. Nakamura was sketching equations that looked more like works of art than scientific notation. They hadn't just defended themselves. They had shown the universe that conflict was just another form of communication. And this was only the beginning. 5 years after the quantum confrontation, the universe had become something entirely different. The Concordance Administrative Complex, once a symbol of rigid, millennia-old bureaucratic control, now pulsed with living information. Where marble and steel had once defined its architecture, now quantum membranes shifted and breathed, reflecting the fundamental transformation that humanity had initiated. Zinlar stood at the central observation chamber, no longer just an analyst, but something more. The neural augmentations that had once separated species now created connections that defied traditional understanding. "We were wrong," Zinlar transmitted to the collective consciousness, the message rippling through informational networks that were more alive than mechanical. Completely and fundamentally wrong. Captain Alina Rodriguez sat in the New Horizon Research Complex, which was no longer just a research facility. It had become a beacon, a living testament to the potential of conscious evolution. Dr. Carlos Ramirez and Lieutenant Mai Chen worked nearby, their consciousness intertwined with the adaptive technology that had transformed not just human understanding, but the very fabric of interstellar communication. The transformation had not been a conquest. It had been an invitation. Dozens of alien civilizations that had once viewed humanity as a potential threat now participated in what could only be described as a continuous, living dialogue of possibility. The rigid hierarchies that had defined interstellar relationships for millennia had dissolved, replaced by something more fluid, more alive. Humanity's greatest discovery, Alina explained during a multi-dimensional communication session, was not a technology. It was an approach to existence. The adaptive technology had become something beyond classification, part communication network, part living organism, part philosophical framework. It existed in the spaces between traditional understanding, constantly evolving, constantly inviting new perspectives. Zara 9, the junior Concordance analyst who had first experienced the transformation, now led a new form of interdimensional research. Her work blended mathematics, emotional intelligence, and something that looked suspiciously like art. "We are not exploring the universe," Zara 9 would often transmit. We are in continuous conversation with it. The quantum confrontation had revealed something profound. Conflict was not about destruction. It was about communication, about the continuous process of mutual understanding. Humanity had not conquered the concordance. They had invited it to evolve. Research facilities across multiple star systems now looked more like living organisms than traditional scientific complexes. Walls breathed with information. Communication networks sang with possibilities that defied traditional computational models. Dr. Nakamura, who had first monitored Elena's transformative neural patterns, now led a research initiative that explored consciousness as a dynamic, continuous process. His work suggested that intelligence was not a fixed state, but a constant invitation to reimagine possibility. The human approach had fundamentally transformed how civilizations understood themselves. "We don't solve problems," Elena would explain during multidimensional communication sessions. "We create conversations that make problems obsolete." Sinler reflected on the journey. The concordance had spent millennia categorizing, controlling, maintaining rigid structures of understanding. Humanity had shown them that the universe was not a problem to be solved, but a continuous dialogue to be explored. The adaptive technology continued to evolve. Each moment brought new possibilities, new ways of understanding that went beyond traditional scientific or philosophical boundaries. Ramirez discovered computational models that were more like living poetry than traditional algorithms. Chen developed communication networks that could feel, that could dream, that could invite new perspectives with each informational pulse. And at the center of it all was Elena Rodriguez, not a conqueror, not a traditional leader, but an invitation to continuous evolution. The research complex had become more than a facility. It was a living testament to human potential, a beacon that transmitted a simple, profound message to the universe. Existence is not about maintaining boundaries. It's about continuously reimagining them. As the quantum membranes of the New Horizon complex pulsed with impossible colors and living information, humanity had done more than make first contact with an alien civilization. They had shown the universe how to have a conversation with itself. And this was just the beginning.